you think the tech bans on China work, or do they make the Chinese more determined to come up with their own local versions, as with DeepSeek, as with Huawei with the Ascend chip? I mean, are the bans having in a weird way the opposite effect?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they have forced the Chinese in terms of chip manufacturing and everything to go full speed ahead. Basically, it's very hard in the world we live in with open source software and everything. The Chinese are not going to get substantially ahead of us, and we're not going to get substantially ahead of the Chinese. The AI technologies will be available to the world, and people can build on those in their own way. The notion that it was going to be super unique to us, we made clear to them that they needed to make their own chips, and they're making great progress on doing that.
Welcome to GBS Deep Dive. I'm Najma Minhas. Most of us enjoy watching Hollywood movies, and regardless of the genre, whether it's action, drama, science fiction, there's one thing that we see over and over again: sequels, part 2, part 3, and sometimes even entire cinematic universes. Well, the global tech war between the United States and China is starting to feel the same way. From banning Huawei's 5G equipment in 2020 to cutting off advanced chip exports in 2022, and now in May 2025, Washington has launched the next installment, a worldwide crackdown on Huawei's Ascend AI chips. It has warned that any company globally using these chips will be subject to the repercussions of not following US export controls. But unlike the movies, this isn't entertainment. This is real. It's strategic, it's economic, and political. And the stakes aren't just for Huawei. They're for the future of global technology. Today we ask, why has the United States banned Huawei's chips worldwide? Will this ultimately work out in the United States' own favor? And what does it mean for China and the rest of the world? On May 13, 2025, the United States Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Industry and Security, rescinded President Biden's AI diffusion rules. This was that overcomplicated three-tier system of how many chips could be sold to different countries around the world. But something new was added instead, which has China now back up in arms. The BIS added towards the end of its announcement a sweeping guidance that using Huawei's Ascend chips anywhere in the world violates the United States export controls. 2 days later, the language was slightly revised again, and now it said, issuing guidance alerting industry to the risks of using PRC advanced computing ICs, including specific Huawei Ascend chips. Basically saying that Huawei's Ascend semiconductor chips are subject to the US export controls on the basis that they were either developed using US origin electric design automation software, such as those provided by Cadence or Synopsys or Siemens, or they were manufactured with tools which contain American components. And as a result, they fall under the jurisdiction of the United States Export Administration regulations. What's more, they didn't even feel it was necessary to actually give any excuse or justification for what they were doing. And at the bottom of the notification, they simply wrote, today's actions ensure that the United States will remain at the forefront of AI innovation and maintain global AI dominance. So the policy is a clear shift from trade to strategic containment, and it doesn't even attempt to hide it. US export controls are laws that regulate the transfer of sensitive goods, software, and technologies across the world, especially those with military or dual-use applications. Now, these controls apply not only to exports from the United States, but also to foreign-made goods that contain more than 25% of US origin content. And this can go low as 10% if you're an embargoed country, like, for example, Iran and Russia, and nowadays China as well. Now, the United States has used these controls as a geopolitical tool to restrict adversaries' access to critical technologies, influence their global tech ecosystems, and to pressurize governments into aligning with US strategic priorities. Now, with this latest action, it's clear that the United States has realized that it cannot control Chinese technology development through its own export controls alone any longer. So, for example, earlier, it was saying that it would not export XYZ chips to China, or Chinese companies. Now it's realized that that strategy has failed. So now it's trying to blackmail, in essence, other countries to stop using Chinese AI technologies. The US intends to ensure that it does everything to prevent a multipolar AI system and an AI future for the world. Now, while US export laws have long had extraterritorial reach, what makes this action unprecedented and alarming is the expanded scope and enforcement posture the latest guidelines suggest. At its very basic level, one can think of this action as digital colonialism on the world. As one user posted on X, anyone, anywhere using Huawei's Ascend chips could be prosecuted for violating US export restrictions. A Chinese company using a 100% Chinese designed and manufactured chip in China could be violating US export restrictions. So you better stick to US AI chips. The guidance is basically saying that you cannot even use a Chinese LLM on systems that are, for example, using US AI chips such as NVIDIA. To take an extreme example of a toy company, let's say in Singapore or Malaysia or Cambodia, it uses Huawei's Ascend chips developed with US tools. It could be found in violation of US export controls, even though it doesn't sell any technology products. The US could restrict its access to American goods, services, or markets. And in serious cases, the company could actually be added to a restricted entity list and face criminal prosecution. Now, being on this entity list effectively means you get completely cut off from the financial international system, as global banks will now refuse to do any business with you. They refuse to process any of your transactions out of fear that they may be violating some kind of US sanctions law. Now imagine if this could happen to a simple toy company. Now that's really crazy. By the way, there is historical precedent for what the US is currently doing, and it goes back to the Cold War. Back in 1949, during the Cold War period, the US and its allies formed what is called the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, CoCom, and its goal at the time was to block high technology exports to the Soviet bloc. Now, different features included banning technology transfers, which involved even the smallest of US components, and coordinating restrictions across NATO-aligned nations. So, for example, in 1987, a Japanese firm, Toshiba, and Norway's Kongsberg Group were caught selling advanced submarine propeller equipment to the USSR. The US Congress erupted at the time and threatened sanctions and launched hearings on what happened. The scandal caused a diplomatic fallout with Japan and a US boycott of Toshiba products at the time. However, the US was able to put pressure on allied nations to enforce Washington's controls, as it was at the height of its power at that time. CoCom was dissolved in 1994, but the logic is living on. I mean, if you think about what the Ascend chip ban is doing, it's the US trying to assert its extraterritorial control over the global technology. Now, there are lots of implications that arise from this guidance by the US government. First, it's not simply a regulation on exporters or re-exporters, but it's a warning to the global end users, including the governments, the telecom operators, the cloud providers, that merely using Huawei's chips could be a violation. Second, it targets a mass-produced commercial AI chip, not the military equipment or those dual-use equipment or surveillance tools, which was what was traditionally done. Huawei's Ascend chips are in everything. They're in AI training clusters, they're in healthcare systems, they're in toys. So what this is doing is marking an expansion of the US control to the civilian infrastructure. And third, it signals an intent to enforce compliance in third-party nations, including those outside what was traditionally the US allied nations. Now countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, where Huawei especially is widely used for a number of reasons, including and most importantly, because it's really cheap. They now face many possibilities of secondary sanctions or even market blacklisting. Similar issues arise over using DeepSeek, which is free and open source on NVIDIA models. Basically, the United States is taking away the country's digital sovereignty decisions by imposing on them monopolistic choice of NVIDIA, that's it. That's all you're allowed to buy use. Finally, the ban provides no clear threshold of how much US input constitutes jurisdiction. So even the most minimal use of American software in the design process, whether it's for testing, layout, or verification purposes, may trigger this US export controls. Now, this introduces a legal ambiguity and really gives Washington too broad a discretionary power. In essence, the United States has shifted from controlling technology exports to asserting control over technology use worldwide. And this is a significant escalation in this ongoing tech confrontation that it has with China and that everyone else is getting involved in. And it is a strategic move to globally isolate Huawei from the future of AI infrastructure deployment. China's response so far has been to call out the United States, to accuse them of trying to colonize the global tech landscape by forcing fragmentation. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce issued a strong statement accusing the United States of abusing export controls and undermining global trade norms. Huawei itself has issued a response saying that the chips were developed independently with independent Chinese IP and fabricated at SMIC, the Chinese company, using domestically sourced equipment since those post-2022 restrictions that were imposed by the United States at the time. So what makes Huawei's chips so important? Well, Huawei's Ascend chip line was first introduced in August 2019 with the Ascend 910, which was hailed at the time as the world's most powerful AI processor. Now, in my recent vlog, I did cover how they are reaching levels of NVIDIA performance, and I'll put a link to that as well so that you can take a look at it. It has much more detail. But it's no surprise that it's created a panic in the US tech industry and in its policy-making circles. Every time something new comes out, NVIDIA's stock price goes through the floor. Market intel indicates that Huawei plans to begin testing its Ascend 910 with select Chinese technology companies as early as next month. What they're aiming to do is to challenge NVIDIA's high-end AI chips like the H100. Now, the Ascend 910 is designed to offer that enhanced performance over its predecessor, the 910C. I've got all the details in my last vlog. And it's part of Huawei's strategy to provide domestic alternatives to Chinese companies amid US export restrictions like the ones we're now seeing again. Benchmarks show that the Ascend 910C performs comparably to NVIDIA's A100 and its H100, and yet it's 50% cheaper. Now, Huawei's already shipped around 700,000 of these Ascend chips in 2024 alone, despite all the production challenges that it faces at SMIC, which is China's leading semiconductor foundry. Now, this affordability and scale poses a direct threat to US companies like NVIDIA, especially in developing markets that are seeking AI infrastructure at a much lower cost. Huawei has pledged to invest approximately $4.1 billion in building a fully US independent AI chip ecosystem by 2027. And it's also announced that the Ascend 920 chip that is anticipated to start mass production in the second half of this year, 2025, aims to match NVIDIA's H20 chip in performance and further expanding Huawei's AI chip portfolio. Now, Huawei's rollout of this Ascend 910 chip and the upcoming Ascend 920 is a significant strategic threat to the US for several reasons. NVIDIA currently controls around 80% of the global AI accelerator market. Huawei offering this higher performance, better efficiency, lower cost alternative will cut deeply into the US market share, especially in emerging markets. But remember though, it's not just about NVIDIA as a US company. It's the policy makers are actually worried about the threat that this imposes on US technology monopoly overall, and therefore the spread of US systems through the world. Now, the cost of the Ascend chips, which is estimated to be around 30 to 50% lower, which are compared to the US chips, makes them selling like candies across the global south, which is looking for cheaper products. But Huawei also, which is what scares the United States, actually combines them with all the other things that it offers. The MindSpore, the Harmony OS, the Chinese version, of the operating system, and so on. So Huawei also bundles them with its own cloud storage system and AI platforms like the Mindspore or the Harmony OS operating system. And overall, the model affords a much more affordable, exportable Chinese alternative to the world, which of course threatens the United States model of high margin and tightly controlled tech systems they send off to whoever they particularly like or not. So this expansion of Chinese AI infrastructure across the world erodes the United States' leverage across global AI infrastructure. Now, AI, as we know, is becoming the foundation of all national economies, defense, healthcare, and governance. And if countries start adopting the Chinese AI chips and software stacks, the United States will lose influence over global data systems, over the regulatory standards and security architecture. A world powered by Huawei silicon is a world where the United States can't pull the plug, unlike what it can do with NVIDIA, AMD, or Intel-based systems. And the US, by its own actions, will only end up shaping a parallel technical ecosystem, with Huawei's chip lineup along with Chinese software like the Pangu AI and the operating system I mentioned earlier, Harmony OS, forming a comprehensive, self-contained eco-tech system. And this tech system is going to appeal to all those countries which are wary of US surveillance. They're wary of dollar dominance and all the political strings that come with anything to do with the United States and the Western system. So the US, which intended to kneecap Huawei by blocking advanced chips to it, like those made by TSMC and ASML tools. But what Huawei's partnership with SMIC has done, using those older 7nm processes, is producing increasingly powerful chips domestically. Now, this shows that the US export controls are not halting China's rise, but instead they're accelerating indigenous innovation. As Bill Gates said, it will never work.
Do you think the tech bans on China are work, or do they make the Chinese more determined to come up with their own local versions, as with DeepSeek, as with Huawei with the Ascend chip? I mean, are the bans having in a weird way the opposite effect?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they have forced the Chinese in terms of chip manufacturing and everything to go full speed ahead.
An interesting side note to think about here is during President Trump's recent visit to the UAE and all the agreements that were signed, especially on the data centers, the UAE is now going to set up what is going to be the world's largest data center. It's going to be powered with 5 gigawatts. It's going to be over 10 square kilometers. And it's going to be able to access over 500,000 of those NVIDIA chips, especially the H100s and the up-and-coming B100s. And these are going to be annual. But crucially, this data center is being promoted as being Huawei-free zone. Sources confirm that the deal has provisions in there which discourage that the Ascend chips will be used in the UAE government and infrastructure projects. Now, this is a geostrategic move to box Huawei out of the Middle East, an area where it previously led in 5G and digital services. The UAE is keen to develop itself as that major AI center, and how it intends to unplug Chinese technology out of its system to please the Americans yet isn't very clear. There are 3 major global consequences that will result from the implementation of any of this United States guidance that's just come out. First, the world is looking at a huge legal overreach. The United States is claiming jurisdiction over products which are built entirely abroad. Now, as long as American tools were used in its development. And so we're talking about millions of things that could be involved there. While historically the US has been able to enforce this, for example, as I mentioned earlier during the Cold War, that was during a period in which the United States power was hugely disproportionate to other players, unlike this current multipolar system. Secondly, it was able to impose this on allies, even then not on globally on every other country. What the United States is doing is encouraging a global tech fragmentation through these export controls, but blacklistings and bilateral pressure. And it's signaling to countries that they cannot freely adopt Huawei's AI systems without risking access to US markets or US technologies. So nations like Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, and Pakistan where Huawei is building cloud and AI capacity, they're going to get increasingly caught inside this geopolitical tug of war. And they're going to have to make decisions, tough decisions, about their relationship between the United States and China and what is the cheapest way to deliver AI infrastructure to their population. Now, US officials are very clear about this choice that has to be made by countries. And as one put it, countries that adopt untrusted vendors like Huawei are putting their digital infrastructure at risk and may face consequences in future tech partnerships. Now, meanwhile, Huawei itself has warned that these pressures will push countries to build independent tech ecosystems away from US controls. Now, what this will do is to encourage a further rise of a parallel stock. China is accelerating the build-out of open-source domestic AI software and hardware. And over time, this will lead to a bifurcated tech world, a US-centric and a China-centric. Now, this is China's only viable strategic option, given the direction that the United States is heading. China will have to accelerate its technological and financial decoupling from the United States, and seems like from the Western countries as well. It will have to reduce its reliance on American chips, software, and dollar-based finance. Now, China could aim to neutralize the impact of any future sanctions if it acts now, and that's probably how it's now thinking. It's already taken massive investment in semiconductors. It's developed a digital yuan and is developing global trade agreements which are outside the US sphere. China's allotted over $170 billion last year in its semiconductor self-reliance fund. And it's expanded, for example, CIPS, which is that alternative to SWIFT, so that it can settle much more trade in yuan with countries like Pakistan, Russia, and Brazil. History suggests that once you start weaponizing innovation, the unintended consequences are often exactly what you're trying to avoid. You're trying to prevent the acceleration of your rival's independence, and that's exactly what ends up happening. Thank you so much for giving me time today. Do subscribe and like the video and share if you value the analysis that I try doing, and have a great day.